99, the big 99. A prodigal son returns home from Eastern Orthodoxy and Buddhism with my good friend Nick Chinappi. Guys, before we jump into this morning's episode, which is unique because usually it's at night, but this time we're doing a morning stream, so hopefully people are awake and ready to tune in. But before we do that, I just want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario. For the best service and finest cigars, go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. If you would be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give their page a like, I would greatly appreciate it. Well, today is a very momentous day. Nick, unlike a lot of my guests, is not famous, but he's famous in my eyes, and he's a treasure in my eyes. Me and Nick go back probably to 2015. We met online, and we've been friends ever since. And he's been a big inspiration in my walk in Catholicism. He's taught me a lot about redemptive suffering. He's taught me about the disposition of the saints and just how to live a devout life. And he's really inspired me. So, Nick, I know it's a little bit earlier on your end than mine, but how are you doing this morning, brother?
Doing good. Yeah, the kids are asleep. Everybody's quiet right now, so hoping that continues. I don't have a library. Like you said, I'm not famous. So we're doing this in my living room.
It's all good, brother. Well, I'm just so happy to have you here, and you have an amazing story to tell. So for those who don't know you, which is going to be a lot of people, the majority of people who watch this, tell me about your faith life growing up when you were young. How was your formation, and were you raised Catholic? Are you a convert? What's the deal there?
So I was baptized Catholic, made our sacraments of initiation at a young age, pretty much how most Italian Americans in New York, grow up. My sister and I went to Catholic school up until I moved to Florida with my father. We went to Mass pretty much every day. It was like you had to at school. A lot of so we went to Archangels in Rochester, New York, which when we were kids, I guess was like a particularly traditional school. Very, okay. I couldn't tell you what books we learned out of for like secular topics, but we learned the faith out of the Baltimore Catechism.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. The old one too, with all like the old artwork.
Yeah.
Picture of Jesus on the front holding the book. That was what we had. And so a lot of our formation centered around learning the faith out of little manuals like that, but also the lives of saints. Reading about the lives of saints was a big deal for us. And I would say that those years at that school really kind of played a part in me forming my own individual identity, that this was like part of who I am. This is just, part of my existence. So it was really influential. And it was a good experience for me. I didn't have any kind of horror stories with the church, so I always kind of had a positive attitude when it came to the church. When I moved with my dad in South Florida, we went to Mass every week, but he wasn't really like, we were kind of like non-practicing. It wasn't like too religious of a house.
Yeah.
But I still maintained a lot of that interest. And as I got a little bit older, and I had that kind of spiritual awakening, for many of us, when we get older, there's a point in our lives when God becomes real, for us. And so, as that happened to me, that's when I kind of began exploring, learning about church history and stuff from a more of an adult perspective. And that eventually led me to Orthodoxy.
Okay, so when did you start, like, at what age around, in what circumstances did God start to become real to you? Did this happen when you were like in your teens, a little bit older? Like, when were those seeds kind of really starting to flower?
So I would say that it was always kind of there, but throughout high school and stuff, I was not, obviously not devout. I would say that I was kind of like any Catholic who grew up with it, who, you know, believed in God, but didn't necessarily practice, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
But yeah, when I was 18, 19, somewhere in there, that's when I started to kind of examine my life and have more, you know, existential questions. You know, what is life? What is death? What happens after death? Does anything happen after death? You know, we'd all learned the dogmatic answers to those things, but
Yeah. Hmm.
you know, it's those questions were kind of reemerging in my heart, and that is what I would say pointed me in the direction of becoming more of a practicing member of the church.
So you had obviously a deeper connection with God. You were starting to ask existential questions.
Yeah.
When you had these types of questions, like where were you turning? Were you turning to like these manuals that you grew up with? The any books in particular? Were you talking to priests? Like what was your kind of direction? Who was directing you?
So initially, I think that my immediate recourse, basically one day, you know, I can sum it up in one event really, where I was really nervous. I had been reading Homer's The Iliad, and you know, there's parts in there where King Priam seems to be this really pious guy, but it's kind of his piety that was the problem. You know, he wouldn't listen to his generals and stuff. He trusted priests over them, kind of deal. So what happened with me was that I was wondering, you know, like, look at this guy. He expected the gods to do all the work for him, and in the end, his city was burned to the ground. You know, is Jesus kind of that same mythological figure? You know, what about Muhammad? Muhammad says that he had a relationship with God. What about all these figures? And I was asking that question. I was really stressed out. Like, what happens if you die and you suffer eternal punishment just because you're a human for no other reason? You go to hell because you're a human. And it just so happened that I was in my mother's house, and she had a Bible like underneath her, like in the drawer of her coffee table. So I
Hmm.
asked, you know, just out loud, you know, what happens when you die? And I just flipped it open, and it was Revelation, and he will wipe every tear from their eye, and there will be no more wailing and pain. You know, I was like, wow. And I actually had a conversation with my grandmother shortly after that, and that's kind of what pushed me on the path to taking faith seriously and asking serious questions that you're doubting
Yeah.
about. You know what I mean? But asking them, and asking them to God. So after that, I kind of started reading the Bible more, and I moved again. I moved back in with my dad, and I ended up going to Catholic Church, you know, and then I started having a lot of questions about how Catholic teaching and the Bible are reconciled, because in
Hmm.
my mind there were some contradictions. Maybe not contradictions, but there were some things about Catholicism that I found confusing. It didn't see an obvious answer in the scriptures. So I would say that you know, there was that, but I kind of, while I was reading the Bible and stuff, I was also reading, you know, the lives of saints, especially Saint Francis of Assisi. So I was kind of not in a situation where I was going to go like an evangelical route, but I suppose I started out as any other non-denominational Christian would.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
You know what
So
I mean?
you were kind of like, did any I don't know, any particular like Protestant arguments that you ran across, did any of them sort of, did any of those catch on and kind of form your thought for a while, and that's why you saw supposed contradictions or tensions?
No, what what happened with me is that, like I say, I was starting to learn. I had no idea what terms like justification and things like that meant. It was a very simple early on experience. And then when I started, you know, really getting into being more of an informed Catholic, the Protestant arguments actually made me a little nervous. Like, I would find arguments online where Eucharistic adoration is really just the continuation of Mayan sun worship and stuff like that. And I would be like, dang, man, is that real? Like, is that true? And oddly enough, my biggest help in that were two sources. The New American Bible, in the back, they have like doctrinal topics and where you can find them in scripture.
Okay.
So there was that. And then I also stumbled upon, it had to have been 2007 or 2007. And it might have even been a little earlier than that. It might have been 2006, but I'm going to say 2007. I found Brother Peter Diamond's page.
Mm-hmm.
And he's out there, but his arguments against Protestantism like really secured me to where I felt kind of good, and I felt kind of confident. And then shortly thereafter, I found myself in situations where I was interacting with a lot of evangelicals who were also kind of new in their faith,
mm-hmm.
but I had a lot of background information about the Catholic Church at that point to where I was able to interact with them, and 5 of those guys were baptized. They became baptized, confirmed, Eucharisted Catholics. So,
wow, that's amazing. And it's funny that Brother Peter Diamond actually gave you confidence in the faith against Protestants. And, obviously he's a sedevacantist for people who don't know who Brother Peter Diamond is, but a broken clock is right twice a day, obviously. So, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware of your history with Brother Peter Diamond. So that was around 2007, right?
Somewhere in there, 2007, 2008, right in between there, because it was definitely that year we went to New York City, and I was like visiting all the Franciscan churches up there. I went to the Church of St. Francis. I went to a CFR friary. I did a little bit of visiting while I was up there. By that point, I had already found Brother Peter Diamond and stuff. I had already kind of made up my mind. I had talked to our pastor at St. Elizabeth Ann Seton in Coral Springs that, I talked to him about sedevacantism even, about Brother Peter Diamond and stuff. And he didn't give me very big ecclesiological or theological arguments for why I shouldn't go there. He just gave me really simple reasoning. These guys are kind of isolating themselves from the church, and they can't make use of everything that the church has to offer.
Mm-hmm.
So you being someone who's, born and raised Catholic, and you're coming back in trying to get serious about it, you should kind of forget about those guys for now, and instead focus on having a faith in the Eucharist and stuff like that. So very good advice there. So by that time, when I was in New York, having my little Franciscan safari there, I had already, kind of closed the door on
on that aspect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I mean, obviously you got some wise counsel, and you took the good out of what you heard from Brother Peter Diamond and put it to use. And that's what Catholicism is all about. And people need to realize is that we believe that seeds of the word, seeds of the Logos, Christ, are distributed or scattered throughout the world in different philosophies, different religions, different sects. And those are seeds of truth amidst, darkness and error otherwise. But these seeds of truth are meant to guide men and women to the fullness of truth and to the fullness of faith, which is the church. So we take the good wherever we find it, because truth is one. As St. John Paul II said, truth is one. And I think he said religion and reason are 2 wings of the spirit, 2 wings on which the human spirit soars. So, very good that you were able to take the good out of Brother Peter Diamond, put it to use to refute Protestantism. And then you went back to a wise pastor who just gave you simple but solid answers, right? This is what you need to do. You need to be incorporated and stay within the life of the church. And you're on your Franciscan safari, as you put it. So you're getting great exposure to our faith, but in a very deep manner. It's gone way beyond what is superficial, which so many cradle Catholics unfortunately experience. So like when you're at this stage, are you seeing like fellow Catholics or interacting with them, and do you kind of feel bad for them? Like these guys have a very superficial understanding. Their faith life isn't deep. They don't have an encounter with Christ. Like, did you see much of that around?
Not really. In my when I was early on, and I was kind of traveling, like I say, before 2010. No, my relationship with other Catholics was a matter of seeing them at the parish. It wasn't really at that point. I had no understanding of like internet groups that debated stuff or anything like that. The Catholics that I met, especially in New York, especially at the Church of St. Francis of Assisi in New York City, I would say that the Catholics there, perhaps if I gave them some sort of dogmatic quiz, perhaps many of them would fail. But at the same time, they all seem to be living the faith in a way that kind of showed you that inside they did have it correct, even if they might not be able to articulate that as skillfully as, a really great orator or something. But no, I would say that the parishes that I had visited, everybody seemed really, really pious, and I kind of wanted to get in on the action. You know what I mean? Where the Church of St. Francis of Assisi, I was so impressed with, because it was like 24/7 busy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I found myself visiting that church multiple times a day, and
Wow.
it was like busy all the time. Homeless people. I mean, in the mornings, it was like all the friars after morning prayer and their conventual mass, they would come out onto the sidewalk and line up these tables. And it was like they were feeding like the whole neighborhood.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so I found it to just be like I was still young in my journey, but maybe I didn't know what I was looking at necessarily, but no, I didn't see any kind of deficiency or any kind of bad catechesis or anything like that. I noticed that I had been the one who didn't really have too good of an understanding, because I had to kind of go looking for answers. Whereas a lot of those guys, I was kind of wandering, trying to find a home in the church, and those guys had already found it. You know what I mean? They were already on the path. So that was my experience.
That's really amazing. You hear so many stories of people who had, bad experience or bad catechesis growing up in the church. But not only did you have good catechesis and good examples, you had a thriving parish community where everybody seemed to be on fire for the Holy Spirit, even though, like you said, they might not be able to articulate theological expositions or whatever. They might have failed a dogmatic quiz, but inside the faith was alive, and I'm sure that had an effect on you that was infectious, and you wanted what they had. You wanted a piece of the action, right?
Oh yeah.
So how do you go from that? Okay, so you're on fire for the faith. You have a great community. You're visiting church multiple times a day. You're seeing the homeless fed, and you're seeing the corporal works of mercy put into action. So how do you go from that to, okay, you're studying church history, and you're starting. Oh, somebody's watching from Kenya. Nice. Simon Peter. Well, welcome, brother. Welcome, Tom. Welcome, Beyonsef. Yeah. So we got some action here, even though it's early in the morning. That's great, guys. Please share. If you know somebody that's been involved with Eastern Orthodoxy and or Buddhism, please share, and this stream might be able to help them. So, how do you go from that, Nick, to studying church history and being drawn to Orthodoxy? Like, what are you finding as you're studying church history that's jumping out at you to sort of make you question things about Catholicism? What oddities are you finding? What hiccups are you encountering?
So earlier I was saying that, we read out of the Baltimore Catechism and stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of the books that I had read at that age, and as I got older, in the circumstances that we were just talking about, were like tan books. You know what I mean? Those old school tan books.
Right.
And it seemed, at least on the surface of it, that the church that these books were talking about and the church that I was attending are like two different things now.
Okay.
Two completely different things. I had gotten into the Liturgy of the Hours. Maybe I was 18. I was into the Liturgy of the Hours even before I went to New York. So I was young. So I had like books from Tan explaining how to pray the divine office that had absolutely no relevance because they were speaking of the Roman breviary, whereas I was praying the Liturgy of the Hours. I had books that were explaining the Mass, but the Mass was the traditional Mass.
Right.
So some of that was confusing. At that time when I had begun to question, well, at that time when I had begun to notice Eastern Orthodoxy, it was because I had been reading Lives of Saints and I encountered some Orthodox saints. For example, Saint Sergius of Radonezh. He's a Russian Orthodox saint. He founded Trinity St. Sergius Lavra, which was like their biggest monastery for a very long time. He was definitely almost like a Russian version of St. Benedict, really prominent kind of monastic saint. And the Russian saints, I mean, they're kind of all like that, where a lot of the great Russian saints were monks who kind of were just simple monks who were exceptionally pious. So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then right around that time, I met my ex-wife. And she was also looking into Eastern Orthodoxy. So what kind of started bringing us together was that, to where we found an Orthodox parish, which was a Greek parish. And when you, for the first time going into an Eastern Orthodox church as a Catholic who kind of grew up in the post-Vatican II church, you're like overwhelmed by the amount of chanting, incense.
Yeah.
They're lighting candles. They're like, I mean, you're just overwhelmed, and it's such an exotic experience. Like even when they hand the prosphora out at the end of the liturgy, and you're kind of watching it, the Antidoron, and you know you're seeing crumbs of it. It's like, wait, is that the Eucharist? And there's like crumbs falling all over the what is going on in here? You know what I mean? So it's like overwhelming, you know. So you got to go back. You got to see it again. I mean, it's such an interesting thing. So then you start reading books about the Divine Liturgy to help you understand what you're seeing. Before you know it, you know, I was kind of vested in the community. And I was vested in a lot of those apologetics that are really good silver bullets for Catholicism, if you will, you know. But yeah, that's pretty much what happened to me with Orthodoxy, is just, you know, being a part of that community and being on that quest with my ex-wife. And I think that for her, it was a foregone conclusion. She didn't know too much about the history. She didn't know too much about, you know, the dogmatic part of it. She knew that she enjoyed the Divine Liturgy, and she knew people at that church and stuff. So there were reasons for her for wanting to be there. And me being kind of more the
intellectual,
inquisitive, you know, the lay expert, if you will. I really wanted to kind of explain this in a way that I found it sufficient and satisfying. And yeah, so I got into it, and we were both chrismated and married, and that was about it. There was no single good argument that made me want to be Orthodox. It was just the church that the Tan books were talking about seemed alive in the Orthodox Church, minus the Pope, which you read those little pop apologetics, you know, the Pope didn't have a big deal in the ancient church anyway, man, you know, kind of deal. So, you know,
So for you, you didn't approach Orthodoxy as, okay, I'm going to get my head around things first. I'm going to find a community, and then I'm going to sort of let the two kind of mesh. For you, it was more, you encountered, well, obviously your ex-wife, who was also an inquirer, but for you guys, it was more community first,
Yeah.
experience first,
Yes.
and then sort of to get, I don't want to say if justify is the right word, but well, you have to justify to yourself why you're going to make this change, right? Then you start getting into the arguments. Then you start getting into the apologetics. For a lot of people, it's opposite, right? They study church history, they study the pop apologetics, and they kind of immerse themselves in that. From there, they go find a parish, and then they see how the two worlds meet, and then they're like, okay, this is where I'm going, this is where I'm staying. But for you, is experiential first, and not only that, but you're seeing more of what the church experience that you're reading about in these traditional books. You're seeing in the Divine Liturgy, minus the Mass, and I guess you could use that as an argument, and I'm sure people probably do, and you might have yourself said, okay, well, this is the traditional liturgy, not what I experienced over here. They're two different things. So maybe Catholicism, I don't know, they kind of lost it. Like, so I don't know, what were some of the arguments, like the pop apologetics that you were encountering, that you, I don't know, did you kind of force yourself to adopt them because you enjoyed the experience so much, or did they really take root in your mind, heart, and soul?
For me, my first coming to Orthodoxy and the arguments that I had been exposed to were probably arguments that a lot of your viewers are already familiar with. For example, St. Gregory the Great and his correspondence with the Patriarch of Constantinople, John the Faster, and his condemnation of the title Ecumenical Patriarch, or, Universal Bishop.
Yeah.
So that was a big one. But generally, I would say that my experience with Orthodoxy, it was more like the arguments came after. And then I noticed that as I was starting to kind of engage, I had trouble understanding. I had a good idea of why Orthodox don't accept certain Catholic teaching, but I didn't really understand what the Orthodox teaching was. Like, the people I was talking to were really good at kind of defining themselves in the negative, like, oh, we don't believe in purgatory.
Right. They're defining themselves over and against Catholicism. You didn't really see a positive case, but you saw like a reactionary sort of negative response.
Absolutely. Very, very reactionary. So then, I started getting involved. This is about the time period where I started getting involved in conversations with Catholics and Orthodox in like forums and online, and even, emailing different priests who were supposedly experts about this kind of stuff. Stuff like that. That was happening a lot for me. And the Catholic responses, I noticed, were very good. They not only addressed the issues, but they had their own position that they were good at defending. Not only can we show that this is incorrect, but we could show our position and the reasons why we hold to the faith that we do. I'm going to close my window for a second, Dustin. I think we got some construction going on outside or something.
I hear some hammering. Yeah, it's all good, brother. Do your thing. So guys, if you're enjoying this so far as much as I am, this is great. This is informative. We need this stuff. We need to hear more of interaction between Catholics and Orthodox and how things play out. How do we answer objections? How do we navigate these waters? Nick is here to help us walk through that. So, all right. So you're finding that Catholic responses to Orthodox objections are good, but you're also seeing that Catholicism can make a good positive case for itself. It's not defining itself in terms of what it isn't, but it can make a positive case for what it is and why the church believes what she believes.
Yeah, that was a big deal for me, because a lot of the problems that I was having with being an Orthodox Christian, even after being chrismated, were that our beliefs are a little bit murky. For example, I was attending Greek services, and our pastor was Greek. The whole, we were part of Go Arch.
Yeah.
And I was talking to some monks who were from Rokor, and also a couple who I guess were like Athonite, and some of them lived in Phoenix. So I was talking to these trad monks who were like, yeah, everything you're learning in the Greek church is just
bogus.
It's just lazy. You should have been baptized, this and that. So I'm kind of getting exposure, that kind of experience. And these are the guys who started kind of pushing me to say the Jesus prayer and read the Philokalia and get into, instead of worrying so much about these issues, try to immerse yourself in the spirituality of the church on a very deep level. That way, you can kind of mystically ferret out what's wrong with those pesky Latins. That's kind of the vibe that I was getting from these guys.
Yeah.
And the thing that always got me is that I could see filioque and not believing in filioque. I could see the arguments both sides. You're going to have to pick your poison on that one. You're going to have to pick. You could read books for the rest of your life and still kind of be unsure of which decision that you could make. For me, the statements at the ecumenical councils about the Bishop of Rome were really, really, really difficult to explain. Even in the face of Chalcedon and Canon 28, or I believe that's
28.
It's been a while. It's been a while for me to think about this, but even in the face of all that, these statements just destroyed the kind of understanding that the Pope had primacy because of Rome.
Right, because it was the capital of the empire or whatever.
And that couldn't be further from the faith of those fathers at those councils. Even if, they might wipe his name from the diptychs, the list of bishops that are commemorated at liturgy. We know that happened at an ecumenical council. We know that there was even an ecumenical council where a patriarch attempted to excommunicate the Pope, and that was the worst thing he did at the council. This was Ephesus 2, and the patriarch was Dioscorus. He tried to excommunicate Pope Leo. So even in the face of all that, there was still this sort of resounding Petrine understanding of primacy coming out of these councils, that it just did not sit well with what I was being taught was the Orthodox understanding of ecclesiology and things like that. And really, it made it easier for me to kind of understand what the church actually is. It was those questions that kind of helped me have a better grasp of what Catholic teaching is, because we're not saying that the Pope is the only bishop in the church.
Right.
And there's a lot of, even those statements made at those councils, there's still no denying that there was a bit of a different, not ecclesiology, but there was different practices going on in the East. We as Roman Rite Catholics, when we conceive of the church, we might think of a pyramid.
Right.
And at the bottom of the pyramid, you have the lay people. And then above that, you got the priests and the deacons. And then above that, you got the local ordinaries. All the way up to the top, you got the Pope. So that's a really straightforward understanding. And it makes for good apologetics, right?
For sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? That really, it's a good little
system.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what about the East? How did they see the church? Did they see it in the same way? Well, those statements from those ecumenical councils could give you that impression. And you'll see a lot of Catholics and Orthodox arguing with each other as if they've, the Orthodox are saying, well, no, that's wrong. Or his being at the top of the pyramid is honorary, or this and that. But
Yeah.
really, let's say the Church of Alexandria, for example. What would their pyramid look like? At the bottom, you got the lay people, and then you got the priests, and then you got the local ordinaries. Who's at the top of their pyramid? The Patriarch of Alexandria,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what is the universal primacy of the Pope? Well, now we have this universal pyramid where there's all the lay people, all the bishops, all the, these powers of the church. At the top of that is the Pope and those patriarchs. So
Right.
I'm not saying that the Pope doesn't have primacy, obviously.
Right.
The Pope is the first man that I mentioned. There's the Pope and those patriarchs. Just as if we were to look at the Apostolic Church, we would have at the top of their pyramid, we'd have Peter and the apostles.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think that is what the real issue is how could we possibly recapture that after all these sort of examinations of our doctrines and the developments, the very fruitful and rich developments that have taken place in both churches. After 1,000 years, how could we rebuild that early pyramid that we had going on? That if we look at it like retroactively, that it doesn't seem to fit anybody's ecclesiology, right? Because back then, I mean, can you imagine these bishops saying, yeah, we can excommunicate the Pope? I mean,
yeah.
No, you know what I mean? Like even back then, there were people who were like, we can't do this. You know what I mean? So how do we take our teachings of today and rebuild that pyramid that we had before? So those are the questions that I think are going to be coming up for our great grandchildren, if we go by how slow the dialogue is moving. But that's what it really is. The apologetic part of it, it's really easy to think, of the Bishop of Rome as at the peak of this universal pyramid. But the truth is, he's not up there by himself. And we see how the popes and the patriarchs are kind of coming together now, starting that new ecumenical dialogue where they want to say, we want to sit at the same table and solve these problems.
Yeah.
Now, none of that ever detracts from what our teachings are, because we have these dogmas. And this is the faith of the church. Again, this is taught in the Gospels. This is affirmed at all the councils. This is affirmed from countless church fathers. How those dogmas looked in action, in the past, you might have, your mileage might vary. You might have examples of, a council excommunicating a pope who had died, or the council feeling like they could compel the pope to attend, and if he doesn't attend, we'll just strike his name, stuff like that. But still, that faith that he's the first in the church and that he holds this primacy because of Peter, that's something that's there. And it's not something I think that sits well with any of the Orthodox apologetics at all. And they kind of have to redefine a whole lot in order to get there, as far as primacy. Well, all bishops are Peter, kind of thing. While that's true, it's not. For me, the Orthodox positions, I mean, what is it? If you're Greek, you have one view of primacy. If you're Russian, you have another view. So I think the Catholic position is the more thought out one. But again, we need to kind of examine the meaning of our teaching in light of trying to rebuild that ancient pyramid that we had, that structure that we had. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and like you said, you're still using that word. Like the pyramid was still there. So if you read, I mean, you go back to the Apostolic Fathers, you talk about, was it the letter of St. Ignatius? I forget to which church, but he said the Church of Rome presides in love. You had St. Clement. You had St. Clement writing to the Corinthians, correcting a schism over there. So he had, a universal reach. There's this argument where people say, oh, the Bishop of Rome only exercised power in his diocese. He didn't have supreme, immediate, universal jurisdiction. But if you look at church history, that doesn't really fit the bill at all. I mean, just look at the councils. You have as early as Ephesus, you have, I think it was Philip, the papal legate, who talked about, Rome being the mother and teacher of all Christians. I'm paraphrasing. And you go to Chalcedon. Peter has spoken through Leo. I mean, and the one Eastern patriarch admitted that Leo had authority over the canons. You read the letter of Pope Hadrian I to the emperor that was accepted by the Council Fathers at Nicaea II. I mean, if you think Vatican I makes extravagant claims, Pope Hadrian's speech that was read aloud and accepted by all the fathers, it makes Vatican I look like a poodle.
Yeah.
Like, really.
It does.
And if you look at the sources, you'll find that, for example, you go to the Formula of Hermistos, which I believe is footnoted in Vatican I, where if you're not in communion with the Apostolic See, you're not in communion with the Catholic Church. That wasn't invented in 1870. That goes all the way back to the Formula of Hermistos,
right.
And subsequent, councils and statements by the fathers. I mean, it's clearly there. So to try to deny that and skirt around it and say, well, all bishops are Peter, it should be noted that our ecclesiology, it's not just opposite of what the Orthodox ecclesiology is. We contain what they already have.
Yep.
Plus we have what they're lacking. So our ecclesiology is Eucharistic. The local bishop, that's where the church is, because that's where you have a valid Eucharist. We hold that already. We hold that at each level of the church, there's a Petrine ministry. So you could say at the local level, the parish priest is like Peter over his parish. You could say that the bishop is Peter in his diocese. So we can extend that principle, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, right, all the way to the universal level. So we have that Petrine, multi-layered, multivalent ecclesiology already. We have a Eucharistic ecclesiology already. We just have what the Orthodox sadly don't at this stage. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's not this or that. It's like we have what they have plus what they're lacking. We have the fullness. So I think if we sort of approach the dialogue that way and say, yeah, we agree with you guys on points X, Y, and Z, but look at what you've left. You need that piece of the puzzle.
This is also in Orthodoxy too, interestingly enough, where they have all of those things too. The individuals within the Orthodox Church might not realize that. But the teachings that you just described are found in the hymns that the Orthodox Church has preserved. They're found in the various hagiographies and sort of canonical histories that they've preserved. They're in the lives of the saints that they've preserved. They're in the prayers of the Orthodox Church as far as Peter and his role in the church. They're there in the hymns that are sung about guys like Pope Leo. So the liturgy and the formal prayers of the Orthodox Church still proclaim all these things.
Right.
So really it's not even like these it's not even a situation where it's like they don't have that root in them. It's just it's a matter of explaining it in a way that isn't in the light of the controversy that's happened. Because when we think of that controversy, we think of the division. We think of not trusting them. We think of them not trusting us. We think of all of those things. So that's what the dialogue, I think, is doing first. We're trying to come back together and build that bond of trust where we can sit down and actually talk about these issues. We're not calling you to, come to our country and then kind of, oh yeah, we don't have enough food to feed you type of deal. Like we're trying to reproach the issue and make it, and bring out our common faith that we already have, but that is, there's a separation there because of individuals, really. Yeah. A lot in the Orthodox Church many in the Orthodox Church are not going to accept that. Or when they see something, about a pope and this very lofty Petrine language that's used, they're going to interpret that as symbolic. This is where, the dialogue really needs to we both need to come together and explain these things. You know what I mean? And it doesn't have to be a situation where it's, you guys are going to have to just, come back in sackcloth and ashes or something like that. It doesn't really have to be like that. It can be, we come together. Like when we saw the prodigal son far away, the father ran out to meet him, so they came together. You know what I mean? He wasn't left to just figure out how to get home by himself. The father was waiting for him to come back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, it's in the, and funny enough, the popes who clearly taught universal and immediate jurisdiction, i.e., Popes Leo the Great and Gregory the Great, are saints on the Orthodox calendar.
Yep.
So that's something that they have to try to reconcile. And I mean, if this is such a rank heresy, how can rank heretics be saints? Right.
Yeah, and if you're supposed to learn your ecclesiology from saints, you got to go to the fathers, read the church fathers. Well, which church fathers? Because Pope St. Leo the Great is clearly teaching a universal jurisdiction. He's teaching what I would say is Vatican I
ecclesiology.
Yeah, he's teaching that in the 5th century. So, who do you read?
Right.
And this is where they would say, well, Cyprian.
Even Cyprian had a high Petrine view.
He did. There's a whole thing about Cyprian too. He kind of, after he got into an argument with a pope, I think he was like, well, we don't need a pope anymore.
The issue over rebaptism with Pope St. Stephen. So after that so he wrote 2 letters on the unity of the church. The first one is where he clearly affirmed papal supremacy, and then after his spat with Pope St. Stephen, he's like, well, yeah, we'll sort of modify that. But funny enough, Cyprianic ecclesiology isn't Orthodox ecclesiology either
at all. Yeah.
So that's a kind of an anomaly there.
Yeah.
But you had the same
thing. You can't have
a
patriarch.
Right.
In Cyprian's ecclesiology.
Right.
Cyprian's ecclesiology is that a bishop cannot judge another bishop.
And interesting too is Saint Photius, like he obviously had a spat with the Pope as well at the time, but a lot of people don't. I don't think a lot of Catholics and Orthodox know this. He was actually reconciled with Rome, and he died in the arms of the Roman Church, and that might offend some people, but that's facts.
Yeah. They say I believe that he was reconciled to the Church, and then I believe he died in a monastery in Armenia, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, though, there's an argument over that actually happening. Orthodox historians, I think, will take the position that didn't happen. I seem to remember that was a contentious sort of situation, but I do remember reading in more than a few books that he was definitely reconciled with Rome, and that he passed away in Armenia. I believe that he may have even been banished by the Church of Constantinople.
Oh, really? Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe. Excuse me. I believe that he died in exile for sure. I think he was ousted. I think that was a lot of the problems that he was having with Rome, is that his elevation of the Patriarchate wasn't even legitimate.
Right.
If I'm not mistaken.
Right. So with all that said, Nick, how do you go from that? Because there was a period of time, we haven't even touched Buddhism yet, but there was a period of time after, so you're immersed in Orthodoxy, you're immersed in a community, you're living the Orthodox life, the parish life. I'm assuming you're also praying at home, what would be the equivalent to the Latin Divine Office, and all of that. So you're not just going to church, you're living the faith at home as well.
Sure.
So you eventually, for a while, came back to Catholicism. How did that happen?
Well, I met some really intelligent people, including you, in my little journeys throughout the internet discussions and in real life. And a lot of people that I were talking to really kind of explained Catholic teaching in a way that I found to be very sufficient for me in that I did make a bad decision in kind of letting experience go first when it came to becoming Orthodox. But man, when I started coming back to the church, my issue was more the problems it was creating in my family. We had children, you know, we were all members of the Orthodox Church, and it was like I was bringing the schism into my house.
Right.
You know, and it was a tough situation. But a lot of I started getting really involved in the apologetic world, you know, with arguments online, arguments, you know, all over the place. And for me, the Orthodox Catholic question was almost a stumbling block for me because it wasn't as easy. I could go ahead and plant my flag in the Catholic Church and have all kinds of problems in my personal life, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then I could go and plant my flag in the Orthodox Church and have all kinds of problems in my spiritual life because I didn't believe that that's where I was supposed to be.
Oh wow, what a conundrum!
So it was causing me a lot of grief, really. And finally, shortly before before we divorced, I had made up my mind that I'm going back to Catholicism. I don't really even want to have anything to do with the arguments anymore, and I kind of put it all to bed.
Mm-hmm.
I went back to practicing Catholicism. I went back to, you know, pretty much going to mass every day. You know, I was going to St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church in Boca Raton every day. Staying off the internet, you know, and then we ended up moving to Louisiana, and that was an interesting time for me because I had been exploring, you know, other religions and reading about other religions, just kind of as a lay interest, you know, just reading stuff to be a better informed person, really. You know, what happens if I am gonna bump into a Hindu person, you know? And it's like, well, Hare Krishna, you know, Krishna doesn't claim to save. And that Hindu would look at me and say, you don't even know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? So I wanted to be more well-rounded. I wanted to put pretty much all the controversies that I've been embroiled in, you know, I wanted to put all that on the back burner, just forget about that stuff, focus on, you know, this move and, you know, just pursue my own interests. And, that's when my ex and I really kind of decided we're done, you know, right after we got to New Orleans. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons I'm a little rusty with the Orthodox question is simply because I haven't thought about much of it since then. You know, well, after that divorce, for me, it was done. That was it. I had no interest in kind of debating Orthodox online, debating Orthodox in any setting. Had no interest to go to an Orthodox church. I was really put off by some of the stuff that I experienced in ROCOR. You know, that made it a little worse for me. ROCOR is, in my opinion, and I don't want to be rude or anything, but very, very fundamentalist, very, very tone deaf when it comes to a lot of different issues. After I kind of got involved with ROCOR and saw what real traditional Orthodoxy is, I kind of realized that I don't want to have anything to do with it anyway. And that was it. You know.
So you're going to St. Joan of Arc. That's the parish, right?
Yes, sir.
So earlier you mentioned sort of a point of departure for you was you saw the sort of the traditional liturgy in the Orthodox Church, which was different from what you were experiencing as a Catholic, but now you're going the other way again.
Yeah.
So now, okay, you've had the experience of the traditional liturgy that you read about. You're leaving that behind.
Yep.
How at this point are you reconciling sort of the Novus Ordo with your previous experience, and how, if at all, in which ways or in what ways was the Novus Ordo enriching you? How did you sort of reconcile that spiritually and intellectually?
So when I started, as I was Orthodox and kind of in between churches, if you will, I mean, there were, dude, like in my journey, there were days where it's like I had my foot in one or the other, and I couldn't really give you an answer as to who I actually am or who I'm standing with when it came to the Orthodox Catholic question. I mean, it was really, really that close of a question. But as far as kind of getting back into the new Mass, I had a different understanding of what the Mass is. So as I started asking questions about the Divine Liturgy, and after I started learning stuff about the Novus Ordo and about Catholic worship in general, I didn't really look at it as this is not the Mass that are in those tan books. I started learning, this is the Mass. Those tan books are for something else. It's just dealing with something else. So I started. Another thing is that I hadn't had too much experience in the traditional Latin Mass anyway. So for me to come back to the Novus Ordo, it's a lot like coming back to your mom's house and having the same kind of, soup that she's made her whole life,
Yeah.
Your whole life, you've always had that same soup, but man, that's the soup, that's
what you're raised on. Yeah.
So yeah, the thing that kind of shook me was after attending Byzantine liturgy, going to Byzantine churches, and then coming to the Novus Ordo, it was a music thing. The music, It was like night and day. The inside of pretty much any church that I went to in Boca, it was almost like being in purgatory, where it's like, wow, this is hideous. You know what I mean? It really is. So we have work to do as Catholics, but I started to realize that, you have to find meaning in this room. You have to see this as Christ alive in the hands of the priest. It can't be enough. We may be in situations where we have beautiful artwork, lovely chanting. There may come a day when you have to celebrate Mass in a cave because there are people outside who are going to kill you. So you have to really shed your addiction to external supports and seek to have your only foundation as faith in that Eucharist. That's the total foundation of our faith, that Christ is alive on the altar in the hands of the priest. I think that as I started getting into, going back to Mass and everything, that's where my faith was starting to go. I didn't have that same kind of attitude with Orthodoxy because I think Latin saints of later periods did a way better job bringing that Eucharistic spirituality right to the forefront. It was always there in the Latin West and in the Greek East, but I mean, nobody was talking about it the way St. Francis was talking about it. Nobody was talking about it the way, just like nobody was talking about the Virgin Mary in the same way that St. Louis Marie de Montfort was. I mean, they had similar sayings, but nobody was really drilling it home the way he was. You know what I mean? So it was something like that. It was definitely a culture shock, kind of, and I'll never forget it. It was like they were playing this one song that part of it was in Spanish and part of it was in English, and it was just so crazy. I just couldn't even believe that. I was like, dang, this is what I'm coming home to, man. Whoa. Like night and day.
But you were still, I don't know, you were still content though.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
you had learned, and this is a spiritual problem, right? That we have to primarily deal with.
Yeah.
I mean, I get reading about the old, but here's the thing, Nick, the Novus Ordo, and I've said this before on my channel. I've had expert guests repeat the same thing that I'm about to say.
Yeah.
The Novus Ordo is not some Frankenstein artificially created Mass to appease Protestants. It's not a free Masonic thing.
Nope.
If you read the ancient liturgies, like if you look at, I don't know, like even the description given by Saint Justin Martyr in the 150s, but if you look at liturgies of the early church, and I encourage anybody who's listening to read a history of the Roman Rite by Jungmann. It's in, I think, 2 volumes. It might be 2 volumes, but you can get it for free online as a PDF. And he details the development of the liturgy from the Last Supper to Trent. And he sort of notes, like, he obviously details what the liturgy was like in the early years and how it developed, but he showed some things that really shocked me. For example, communion in the hand was pretty much standard east and west for the first 1,000 years. In the early years, ad orientem and versus populum were used in Rome side by side, depending on the architecture. People used to do all kinds of things with the Eucharist. They used to take it home. St. John of Damascus, I think it was him. He talked about when you receive the Eucharist, like to bless your eyes with it, make the sign of the cross. Like, people did all kinds of things that no one would think to do now. And even, the posture of kneeling, that wasn't done in the East or the West because it was a sign of penance. So when you weren't receiving the Eucharist, you would be kneeling. But the posture of reverence and prayer and receiving the Eucharist was in the hands standing, and you didn't go back to your pew and kneel. So a lot of these things that we think are artificial creations actually go back to the earlier liturgies of the church. And that was one of the things that helped me come to more peace with the Novus Ordo, is like, hey, this isn't what rad trads are saying it is. It's actually faithful to the ancient church. I mean, and not to say that it's perfect, right? I mean, the celebration in a lot of ways could be better. We could do it better, especially with the now restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass. If we want to, bring people in and get people on board with the situation such as it is now, we probably have to do a better job in some respects. But the actual structure of the liturgy, the actual rubrics of the liturgy are just fine, and they're ancient. They go way back to the early centuries. And that was a shock to me, and that was one of the things that helped me come to more peace with it, because I was going down the rad trad rabbit hole for a few years, but I got out of it. And so what you're saying, and this is something that I did as well, is I asked God. This isn't an act of my own will. My will participated in this, but primarily it was an act of grace, right? Where God helped me shed attachments to the externals and look at who was on the altar. And I remember writing a post on Facebook, and this was actually after I had my awakening. And one of those things that also helped me was the concept of redemptive suffering and applying it to the Mass. Okay, if you're hearing hymns that drive you crazy, or things that going on that you think shouldn't be, or that don't tickle your fancy or even irritate you, offer that up as a sacrifice in union with the Eucharist to the Father through the Son and the power of the Spirit. Maybe you don't like the hymn, but maybe somebody next to you in the pew, they hear a line from that hymn or that song, and it stirs their life in them, right? It stirs something in them, and they're driven to greater awe and reverence for the Lord. So maybe it works differently for them. Maybe try to think of it in that way. And just, if the liturgy is quote unquote bad, when you're looking at the altar, picture yourself at the foot of the cross with Holy Mary and St. John, and just focus on the altar, focus on the cross, and things like this. So this is what helped me. I was shedding attachments, and I was offering what I thought was lacking as a sacrifice, and it totally transformed me, Nick. So I used to leave Mass sometimes foaming at the mouth, literally swearing in the car, cursing, being angry, to leaving a school Mass, which I stumbled upon by accident. I remember the parish near my house was having a school Mass. Normally, I would have seen that and walked right out the door. I would have turned on my heels and walked out the door. But I ended up going in there, participating actively, and participating meaning putting myself on the altar with Christ, with the people of God, as the one whole Christ, as the body joined to her head. And I left there as satisfied and fed after receiving the Eucharist as I would have felt leaving a traditional Latin Mass. And that's when I knew God had changed something in me. He had done something in my heart. And now I was able to appreciate and appropriate what the Mass was in its essence. And it changed my spiritual life. It changed the way I felt before, during, and after going to the liturgy. And if I was going to survive as a Catholic and live life as a Catholic, this is what I had to do. And the Novus Ordo, actually, and participation in it is what saved me from going into schism to Eastern Orthodoxy, which I almost did myself in 2016 over the state of the liturgy.
I remember, yeah. We were talking about that a lot.
Yeah.
I remember very, very well.
Right. And so I think these are some of the principles. If people are struggling, if you're of a more traditional mindset and you prefer the traditional liturgy and you don't have access to it in your area, try some of these things. If you want to get the most out of what you have, you know, in the state of the church as it is today, then, you know, try some of these things. You might find a recipe that works for you, and it might totally transform the way you look at and participate in Mass, which is the source and summit of our faith. So if we're going to be faithful Catholics, if we're going to be on fire for the Lord and evangelical witnesses, we have to draw from this. We have to draw from what we have the best we can, right? And look at the positive.
You might not hear, you know, the traditional hymns. You might not hear the traditional chant. None of that is stopping you from having the traditional posture.
Correct.
Having the traditional attitude. You know what I mean? We, as Catholics, sometimes see these demonstrations of piety and these expressions of piety and faith that are in vogue at a time. We sometimes see those things as essentially necessary, but they are not. You know, for example, taking communion directly on the tongue. We would see that, many of us in the church see that as absolutely necessary. But then we see throughout history, I mean, until recently, I believe the Pope communed with a straw. You know, there's all kinds of different things that have happened throughout the course of history, but the real tradition there is the reverence for the Eucharist, the reverence for the situation, the knowledge that the priest is acting in persona Christi. So those things are the more essential components than what hymn you hear or something like that. If you hear music that you don't like, I mean, that's going to be a part of your daily life, where we're always in situations that are objectively good, but I mean, they could be better, right?
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I mean, from TV shows to music. Now, someone might say that doesn't really have anything to do with reverence, though, right? Where, you know, the problem is a lack of reverence in the Novus Ordo. Is it? Is that really what's going on? Or do we have an irreverent attitude when we look at the Mass of the Church? So I'm coming back to the church in a really unique time where a lot of things are being challenged. You know, a lot of things are being criticized that should not be criticized. A lot of people are kind of, especially since the election in America that was stolen or wasn't stolen, whatever. Yeah. But that sort of general dismissal and insulting attitude towards authority and due process. Not simply, I'm not a fan of Joe Biden, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, I don't like either one of those guys. It's not simply that. You know, these guys are mocking the whole thing that we stand for as Americans. And it's happening in our church too, where not only are these guys curious about what certain people are saying in Rome, but they're really challenging if these men have authority at all. It's almost as if, you know, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and the Jews say, who's this guy? You know, take your bricks and get over there, man. We don't want to hear from you. You know, so when we approach the liturgy or anything to do with the church where we are perceiving a lack of reverence, this should invite us immediately to an examination of conscience. Am I looking at this correctly? What about my posture here? What can I do to make this situation better? Dude, hearing bad hymns at church, I mean, that's like the least of your worries. I was in churches where I wouldn't have known if I was in a church or not. Yeah, I mean, St. Joan of Arc, lovely community, cool priests, very good priests, mind you, old priests. You know, these guys have been, the pastor, he had probably been ordained before Vatican II. So he's real old school, very old man. He was a Monsignor. The church looked like a spaceship. I mean, dude, it was like you're looking up at the front
Yeah.
towards the altar, and there's no tabernacle. The tabernacle was like a hole in the wall with
Yeah.
like a door on either side that if you were in the chapel, the priest could access it from there. And if you were doing mass, the priest could walk over to it and access it from there. It was like so weird, so different coming from the churches in New York where they all like had the same architecture.
Yeah.
Same deal, so I get the frustration over the lack of reverence. I do, but I also feel like what you interpret to be reverence might be irreverent to somebody else, and what you think of as irreverent might be bringing that person closer to Christ. Like we joked before, I've said, "Here I am, Lord." Every time I hear that song, an
You
angel
hate it. I love it.
wings, and you love the song,
Yeah.
and you like it, and it's like, dude, there's times where I'm flipping through the Liturgy of the Hours and I'm about to do, the hymn, and it's like, it's almost like some of the guys who put it together were like, let's see how bad we can make this. Some of the hymns are like really, really good. And then some of it, it's like, why would you include that?
Right.
Like, you could have picked any other hymn, but you picked that one, so, but yeah, what's not all that great for me is great for somebody else. And the good thing is that the power of the church is that even in those bad liturgies, those bad masses, those ugly churches, Christ is still calling people to him in those churches. And not only that, all over the world, we're seeing that Christ is still making these men and women have the perseverance of martyrs, that these people are suffering elsewhere in the world, that these people are going to church, even though there's hostility from the states that they live in. There's hostility from neighbors, so even in these ugly scenarios, Christ is still shining,
Yeah, amen. And a couple points I just wanted to bring up before we shift gears a bit. You bring up a good point. What am I doing? Let's say I go to a church that is objectively quote unquote ugly, right? And the music is bad.
Yeah.
But that's my option. So what can I do to what postures can I adopt? What can I do to be reverent where I'm planted? So maybe somebody is watching in another pew and sees how you celebrate mass, and they're like, wow, I want what that person has, or what are they doing that I'm not doing? And I'm not to say to draw attention to yourself, like, look at me, because then you'll be like the Pharisee, oh, I do such and such.
Yeah.
But if it catches, great. But primarily it should be about disposing yourself to receiving the Eucharist and worshiping and actively participating. So for example, if I'm in an ugly church, and thanks be to God, the churches I go to aren't ugly at all. But if I've been in some that were kind of weird, like out of town, right? So what I would do, and what I still do, I've done this for years, is when the priest processes and recesses out of the church, when we have the processional and recessional hymn, I'll bow my head and make the sign of the cross as he passes. At any time the name Jesus is mentioned, I'll bow my head slightly. We say the Apostles' Creed over here in Canada usually. So when he was conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, I'll make a profound bow.
Gotcha.
I'll hold my hands in the prayer posture throughout the entire Mass, except for the homily. So, and I used to receive kneeling and on the tongue without an altar rail. I don't do that anymore, but especially since I've become more comfortable historically and theologically with communion in the hand. But nonetheless, I was doing the things that I could do to make my experience the best that it could be, and be as reverent as I could be where I was planted. And this took such hold of me, and this is what helped me participate so well in the Mass. Couple things. I've had strangers come up to me after Mass and say, wow, I can't believe, I can't believe the faith you have. This happened to me just recently. 2 strangers came up to me after Mass, and they were like, they were dumbfounded. And here I am, they're saying like, what's your secret? And all I could say was, thank you, Lord, and thank you for your generosity. But all I could say was, I'm a sinner. Like, I don't know what else to say. I was just celebrating Mass the way I usually do.
Yeah.
And so that's what I wanted to bring up was, there's things that you can do to get the best experience possible. And that's the thing. This has become so second nature to me that it's rubbed off on strangers. It's rubbed off on my kids. And it's gotten to a point where I have a traditional Latin Mass community that I could still say the TLM 20 minutes away.
Yeah.
I don't feel called to go there. I have nothing against the TLM. It's objectively beautiful.
Yeah.
I've been about 15 times.
Yeah.
But I feel called to stay where I'm planted and be as reverent as possible, for the sake of my family. And even if I was single, I would still feel that this is where God's calling me. Perhaps somebody else's tastes and preferences are different. And by all means, if you have access to a different liturgy that you prefer, go ahead.
Yeah.
But I've learned by the sheer grace of God, and it's totally changed my attitude to participate in the Novus Ordo in this way, regardless of the aesthetics, regardless of the externals. And I feel like $1 million every time I leave Mass, no matter which Mass it is. And this is the act of the sheer grace of God in me, nothing I could brag or boast about. But it took me years to learn how to do this, years. And it's people like yourself that have taught me this. And without that guidance, I don't know where I'd be today. So, okay, you're Catholic now. You're enjoying the Mass. You're praying, even in ugly churches. You're enjoying the Liturgy of the Hours. You're praying. But you eventually came to embrace Buddhism, of all things. You didn't go to Protestantism. You didn't go to Eastern Orthodoxy again.
Nope.
You went to Buddhism. So how in the heck do you go from, being an active member of the Catholic Church, feeling at home, feeling good where you're at, to not only leaving the Catholic Church and staying with Christ, but like apostatizing? Like, how do you go from being Catholic, a faithful Catholic, to embracing Buddhism? Tell me about how this whole thing unfolded.
Okay, so buckle up. This is going to be so I wish I had like all kinds of like philosophical arguments, right? But the truth is that what was happening with me was more my personal situation. So first of all, yes, I was involved. I was going to Mass, just being Nick. I was investigating these other religions. And I realized I actually don't know anything about Buddhism. In fact, I watched a lot of religious TV shows, even on YouTube and stuff. And I noticed when they had stuff about Buddhism, I wouldn't even watch it because I had no interest. None. Now, really quick, about apostasy. So when you become Buddhist, you may not necessarily have to apostatize. Meaning, apostasy strictly is, do you renounce your past life as a Catholic? Do you renounce Jesus? Do you renounce? And someone says yes. That is an act of apostasy. In my case, I apostatized, but this was not necessarily a requirement to become a Buddhist. That was just me being me, not thinking again. But I just wanted to clear that up. But so anywho, as I began to bear in mind, I'm kind of doing all this while my divorce is starting to really solidify.
Right.
So in our situation, my ex-wife and I had a really bitter, really negative, really bad situation. There was a lot of bad things that were going on both parts. You know what I'm saying? I was not a good husband. She was not that great of a wife. We made very, very bad decisions that affected our children. And so I wasn't actually in the best headspace. I blamed a lot of our problems on the church. We'd have a healthier relationship if I didn't let religion have so much of a say-so in our house. I'm the guy who's coming like, man, I really want to be a Catholic, but she's Orthodox. So there's that religious holy war going on in the house.
Right.
Stuff like that. So there was a lot of that going on, which led to resentments for me, not just with the church as an idea, but also with people. I blamed my friends who I was talking to. These guys are filling my head with this dogmatic crap, and it's tearing apart my personal life. It's tearing apart my family life. So I'm looking to place blame wherever I can. And I just decided on blaming Jesus, basically. I'm going to blame Jesus. I prayed for years, every single day, countless times a day, for the success of my marriage. And to see it all just kind of fall apart the way it fell apart was like hurtful to me. It was very hurtful to me. So I began exploring Buddhism in that, angry at the church.
Okay, I see.
So what Buddhism did was kind of call me to sit back a little bit. Why are you angry at the church? Let's start examining all that stuff. What Buddhism did for me is teach me how to sit quietly with myself, where I'm not in a liturgical setting or something like that. I'm learning how to accept me just as Nick Chinappi, and then I suppose that I began my Buddhist little career there as anybody in the West would. I gravitated towards Zen because, that's the non-ritual, non-dogmatic form of Buddhism, which I discovered was not. I have a friend right now who's doing some similar things that I did early on to go into Buddhism. There are times where he describes Buddhism to me, and I do not recognize that as Buddhism. So Buddhism is a very broad topic. I found that I was really interested ultimately in the Tibetan tradition. So I ended up meeting a very influential teacher, Tulku Yeshe Rinpoche, after a variety of different extraordinary circumstances. And he kind of started teaching me meditation and practices that I had always heard were like evil and stuff like that. He started teaching me a lot about, thoughts, the nature of thoughts, the nature of identification, a lot of things that I think really helped me kind of come to peace with like the divorce and the decisions I'd made and things like that. And so yeah, my journey into Buddhism started out as something that was very much, I hate the church. I hate the church members. They're just narrow-minded, dogmatic, rigid. They don't care about people's personal circumstances. They'd rather see your family torn apart than you live happily, provided you believe in a dogma or something like that. I started out my journey into Buddhism with that I hate this stuff. Buddhism is the polar opposite of that. And it really wasn't until I met my former teacher, Tulku Yeshe, that I realized like various Buddhist teachings, approaches to liturgies and stuff are actually not all that dissimilar from the Catholic attitude. In fact, I found myself, the deeper I got into Dzogchen, the deeper I got into that kind of thinking more and more about God and sort of esoteric forms of Abrahamic religion like Kabbalah and even, the spirituality of St. Francis and stuff like that, so yeah, I think that was kind of how I got into it. And that, I started out with a lot of hatred and it kind of quelled as I started getting serious about those practices.
So you mentioned extraordinary circumstances, which led to your entry into Buddhism. And we've obviously discussed this, so I know what you're going to say. But for people who aren't aware, you had an extraordinary circumstance, which basically confirmed your journey into Buddhism. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because it's very, very interesting.
Absolutely. So early on, I had met my girlfriend and we were living in Mississippi. And I realized there was one day that something just stirred in me that I was feeling matter of fact, I was actually in the middle of a kind of a little struggle with my ex-wife where I was having trouble communicating with her for a variety of different reasons. And the negative impact of that was that I wasn't seeing my children as much. And that was really, really destroying me, dude.
I can't imagine.
That was tough.
Jeez.
So it was February. It was like rainy in downtown New Orleans. I was just hanging out on the building. At that time, I was building a tower in New Orleans. I was doing the survey work. Some of the guys on my Facebook were the ones building it. I was watching them work, though, and they were doing great. But so, yeah, I was sitting there, and I was like, man, I am just miserable about this. And I was like kind of examining my feelings, and then it occurred to me that there were countless people on the very street that I was on who were worse off than me, that they were suffering way worse. And then I thought, I wish I could help them. I don't know how to do that. And then another thought occurred to me. A Buddha knows how to do it. A Buddha knows how to help these people. A Buddha can. That's what he does. So at that point, I resolved to become a Buddha, to help all sentient beings. So at that point, I was like, okay, I have to take the refuge vow. And I messaged this monastery in New York, which is a monastery of the Karmapa. There's a Karma Kaigyu monastery. So the monk wrote back. He was like, hey, that's a very interesting situation you find yourself in, because it seems like you've realized what bodhicitta is. Bodhicitta. What bodhicitta is it's that aspiration to become a Buddha, to save all sentient beings. So that fundamental aspiration is like the core of Mahayana practice. That's the basis for Mahayana. We want to go through this spiritual path and work on perfecting ourselves to save others. So we're going to continuously purify ourselves of negativity and things like that. And in doing that, we're going to bring others up with us. So that's the first thing. So he told me, he was like, listen, you can't come up here now. But whenever, you could come up and we could take the refuge vow, but I don't know when that'll be. And I said, well, what do I do in the meantime? You know what I mean? What am I supposed to do in the meantime? And he said, I'll tell you what, pray the 7-line prayer of Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche. Pray that prayer 3 times a day. And he'll figure it out. Tell him that you want him to show you a teacher. So for those of you who don't know, Padmasambhava is the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, and he is the founder of the Nyingmapa school of Tibetan Buddhism. The Nyingmapa is the oldest school of Tibetan Buddhism, and it is known as the Dzogchen school. So Dzogchen is the highest teaching. You learn mindfulness and stuff like that. Those are considered low-level teachings. And then you learn things like deity yoga and stuff, where you're meditating on a Buddhist deity who's kind of beaming light to you and stuff like that. Those are like mid-level teaching. And then when you get to Dzogchen, that's the highest, that there's no higher you can go. The Dzogchen teachings will, clear everything up for you, basically. So that's who Guru Rinpoche is. He's the founder of that tradition. So I began to do that. And shortly after that, I started to experience dreams, where it was like there was just another person almost in my head with me. And it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. In one dream, I was in this old, haunted house, if you will. Like a house that a kid would think of as haunted. Like a dirty, old, towering house with cobwebs and stuff. It wasn't a scary situation, but you'd think of it as, this old haunted house. So This was my house. This was my house. And who pulls up? The Karmapa. He pulls up and he says, hey, can I come in? I need a place to rest. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Come on in. And then I thought, dude, you should ask him right now to give you the refuge vow. Do it. And then I said, no, let me not ask him for anything. Let me just be a good host. So I did that, and then he left, but he left me a note that said, I will show you who will give you the refuge vow. So I was like, okay. And then I woke up. So I begin to do my little morning practice, and my girlfriend starts to wake up. And she goes, hey, where's the 8th floor at? And I was like, 8th floor. I was like, honey, you're having a dream. Go back to sleep. And she was like, no, where's the 8th floor at? And I was like, Nay, you're in bed. There's no 8th floor. You're in your house. And she sat up and looked at me. And she said, no, what is the eightfold path? And I said, oh. And I was like, it's the Buddhist teaching on the end of suffering. You know, why? And she said, because I had a dream where there was a green lady who was telling me to wake up and practice the eightfold path.
And she had no previous knowledge of any of this.
No. And I was like, a green lady. And I looked through my little Buddhist practice images on my phone, and I was like this? She's like, yep, that's her. And it was green Tara. And yeah, it was, I mean, stuff like that was happening. Dude, there was another time where I was in the same house that I had that dream, but this time it was like all clean. And it was like in order, and my kids were in there, and everything was good. And I felt something calling me to the room upstairs. So I went up, and I was in this like tunnel with this figure who was saying, keep going down the tunnel. You see that light? You know, keep going.
Mm. And
as I started to get closer to the white light, I started to get like hotter and hotter. It was very, very hot. And the figure that I was talking to had sort of like distorted their face to where they had my like body shape, but the face was like distorted. I couldn't make out who they were. And he said, you know, you feel it getting hotter as you get closer, you know, you're going to where all beings like you go when you die. That's where you're going. You know, that's the reward for you who have apostatized. And I stopped walking in the dream, and I like looked at him and realized that he didn't want me to know who he was. So I was like, you don't have to trust any of this, Nick. You know, you could walk away. And as I started walking away, I started to realize that I'm dreaming. And that's when I had like my first lucid dreaming experience, which was crazy. And then as I got deeper into the Dzogchen teaching specifically, that started happening like maybe 3 times a week, you know, anywhere between 1 and 5 times a week sometimes, where I could kind of wake up in the dream and do the meditation practices that you're supposed to do when you begin to lucid dream. So a lot of weird experiences like that. When I moved up to Seattle, I moved up here, and I met a Tibetan guy, and he was like, you should call my friend. You know, he's a tulku, and you know, he could give you the refuge vow. So I met Tulku Yeshe Rinpoche on the day that it's a Buddhist holiday, the day that Buddha descended from heaven to teach the humans the Dharma. And yeah, he gave me like a name. He initiated me into the Longchen Nintig cycle of teachings. And from there, I just started really focusing on those practices. But those little oddball experiences like dreams and even situations where I saw them as real, of course, I'm in the situation, it's real, but I saw them as symbolic, because that's kind of how Buddhism is, where you don't really learn the Dharma from books. You learn it from these kinds of scenarios. You learn it from dreams. You learn it from situations where you kind of perceive a meaning behind the occurrence that isn't coincidental. It's not all made up in your head. This is a real situation that happened, and that meaning, this situation was taken. So that's what happened in my case.
Okay, wow. And you told me before that you were involved in some a specific ritual that you did over 100 times.
Yeah.
Could you walk me through that? What exactly did that ritual involve? What was the meaning behind it?
a little bit of Wi-Fi trouble, but
Yeah.
anywho, so yeah, there was a few different rituals that I was initiated into specifically. So one of them is just the basic preliminary practices that, I mean, I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And then there's the more specialized advanced practices such as chewed. So the chewed practice is something that my teacher's really rare for. Well, he was my teacher, obviously. I'm not Buddhist anymore. But
Yeah.
he's very rare for that, in that he is a lineage holder in the chewed practice of this ancient person who is actually in a different school of Buddhism. So somehow he received these practices on top of his Nyingma tradition. So what chewed is essentially, it's known as the offering of the beggar. A beggar has nothing to offer the Buddha. He has nothing to offer creation, really. So he offers his own flesh and blood. So who does he make that offering to? Well, it's an easy thing to make that offering to a Buddha or something like that, someone that's considered nice. But in Buddhism, it would be a higher thing to offer it to someone that we don't like, to someone like demons. So that's what chewed is. It is the act of visualizing oneself as being torn apart, essentially, by demons.
Wow.
Yeah. And that, so in chewed, what happens is you would imagine yourself in the space in front of you, and then you die. So your body kind of falls dead, and from you, this little white sphere of maybe the size of a golf ball comes out of the crown of your head. That's yourself, if you will. And that transforms into a Buddhist Dharmapala, who then takes your body and cuts off the top of your skull and makes it into what's called the Kapala. So that Kapala is a skull cup, it's called. She then chops up the rest of your body pieces and puts them all in that skull cup, cooks it on an oven, and then feeds it to the demons.
Goodness gracious.
It's pretty gory, yeah.
Dude,
So
you
you're
would
like
never
mentally
associate this with
imagining all
Buddhism.
of that.
Wow. You would never, like, hearing this and hearing what mainstream people say about Buddhism, like, you would never, ever think to associate this with Buddhism at all. Like, this is
the highest teaching in Buddhism too. Chewed is so in the Nyingma tradition, there is a form of chewed which is almost exactly as what I just described. There's another tradition called the Machi Glabdrön cycle, which is my former teacher did receive that. So I was initiated in the chewed of Machi Glabdrön and the chewed of the Longchen Nintig cycle. So that's Buddhist. That's the Buddhist teaching. That's the offering of these hostile powers. That is found even in sutra level teachings. Obviously, it's a situation kind of similar to, well, where did Jesus say that he's divine? We can find it, and then we could show you the broad elaborations that many great saints have added to his words to clarify. So it's very similar in that these teachings, they're the product of a lot of reflecting upon the Buddhist teachings. But yeah, this is the core practice of deity yoga. So in Buddhism, it's not just a matter of I'm going to sit and meditate. Buddhism of any stripe, whether you're a Theravadan, Mahayana like a Zen or a Chan, a Tibetan, or even a different form of Vajrayana. For example, there's Shingon Buddhism. That is the Japanese tantric Buddhism. Right. In all of those things, the demands are the same. First, you should clean your shrine. Then you should set your attention correctly. What am I about to do here? And then you take refuge in the Buddha. Then you make an offering, which usually could either be, you'll throw some money in a box, or perhaps you'll make a mandala offering. You cannot, even the Buddhist prayer hands, you can never come to the Buddha with it empty-handed. You always have to have your hands full to offer him something. This is the core practice of Buddhism, that 7-limb prayer of offering, praise, and things like that. And then we come to the body of the meditation, which in that case would be the chewed practice. All of the deity yogas have similar characteristics, in that there's visualization, there's mantra usage, there's specific postures that you have to adopt, and there's the generation of the deity, and then there's the sort of dissolution where you strive to make your nature and the nature of the deity. You're not trying to make them one. You're trying to realize that they already are one. So, yeah, in these very profound and detailed visualization techniques, people have been able to raise their body heat. For example, I was initiated into the Tomo tradition in the Longchen intake cycle, which is similar to the one that you find in other groups, but the primary practice is imagining a fire in the belly. And yeah, you if you hone your concentration enough, there are certain signs that you're doing it right. For example, you will be hot to the touch.
Yeah.
To where somebody will touch you and say, dude, you got a fever. Like, whoa, it will be noticeable. There's been scientific studies that have shown that there are plenty of Tibetan monks who can increase their body temperature simply by using their brain somehow.
That shows you though, the power of the mind.
Yeah.
It's really incredible. Like,
but the thing is too, is that it's not even like it's just subjective though.
Right. It's
because there are other signs.
Yeah. Like, not to detract, but just as a testament to the mind. Like, I have a disorder. People who don't know, it's called somatic symptom disorder. So I've had like symptoms of gallstones, symptoms of MS, and my brain is making my body think that there's a physical problem. It's like women who have false pregnancies. They have all the symptoms of pregnancy. They have morning sickness. They even feel fetal kicks in their belly. They grow bellies, but there's nothing there.
Yeah.
That shows you the power of the mind, the subconscious mind. It's
Absolutely
insane. The untapped potential that's in the mind. I don't think people realize that.
And listen, there's a way. So even with that, there's different, again, signs that accompany those practices to where it is mental. It's all mental, but it's like a common experience that almost makes practitioners think that consciousness is almost like a field that we're all kind of playing in. It's not like it's local, which now scientists would be like, no, consciousness is local. It might be a common effect, but it's local.
Right.
Well, I mean, these experiences, that kind of like made me question a lot. I mean, I could not, dude, if I really got into all of it, not only would your viewers think I'm crazy, but they might associate you as a little nuts for hanging out with me. But I'm telling you, like, there's another thing where you are doing this meditation, especially Tumo, to where your breathing, if you're doing it correctly, your breathing will drop to the point to where your breaths are so non-existent that you see what's called the fireflies. So your eyes are closed and you literally will see like glowing lights and you're not breathing. And you've been like sitting in the posture with fire in your stomach. You're not doing the natural things that a human does. It's like almost like you're entering like a totally different world, dude. I never had any negative experiences where I thought that there was like a demonic situation going on. But when I think back about it, that could very easily be a breeding ground for even perhaps a possession type of scenario.
Well,
Because
especially making offerings to demons, essentially. Like that's pretty clear cut.
yeah, that's definitely like an opening of the door type of thing. And that's why my friends who are Buddhist, I have a couple of friends right now on Facebook who some are just starting to explore Buddhism, and some who they've already been into it, in varying degrees. But the truth is that a lot of these practices are so foreign to Christianity that you've never even heard of anything like that. And when you start to see how they actually look in real life, you might develop like a really serious attraction to them. Because, dude, there's videos on YouTube right now of my former teacher meditating in the snow, in a snowstorm in Seattle, where there's no snow on him. There's no snow around his person. Like, he's got something going on. You know what I mean? To where I started to really believe that this man might actually literally be omniscient because of the things he would say to me. Almost like he knew what was happening in my head. And it seemed like there were other beings in the world who did as well. And like they would say things that would always like kind of like, whoa, I'd have these little enlightenment experiences, if you will. And so, yeah, I would say that if you get into it, you will see these objective kind of crazy things that we in the West think of as just legend and nonsense. But it's not. It's very, very real. And, you're better off kind of sticking to your own tradition in that, and not really venturing out, especially for the people who want to get into Buddhism, but they're doing it solo. My advice would be to actually not do that, to not do that at all. The best medicine in all of those circumstances is to involve other people, involve a pastor. Don't be like me. When I got upset with the church, I was looking, angrily at the church.
Right.
So that clouded my judgment on a lot. But yeah, I mean, involve pastor, get your pastor involved. And if you're curious about those kinds of things to where you want to learn about them, I would avoid kind of going directly to practices where you need instruction and things like that. First of all, I would tell a Catholic to, there's not a whole lot you can learn as far as spirituality goes, from the Buddhist tradition. Everything you need to learn is right here. If you're interested in mindfulness, well, we have that. We have Saint Hesychios wrote a piece in the Philokalia Volume 1, which is called On Watchfulness. He's talking about mindfulness. He's talking about guarding the intellect. He's talking about all the things that are common in all of these different religious traditions, but that the church has taken them and put them in their rightful, reoriented and reordered, corrected form. You know what I mean?
Right.
So the church takes all those things. You can learn a lot of great things from the Buddha. I've told you before that I look at the Buddha as like a pre-Christian, crypto-Christian kind of, to where he wasn't, this demonic Indian running around, worshiping Shiva. It was more that he was this philosopher who kind of rejected all of those superstitions and said a lot of things that are like, wow, he, by his own natural reason, rejected idolatry and believed that there was one coming in the future who would initiate a universal practice of righteousness. He, in my opinion, he had kind of like a crypto-Christian thing, the way Saint Justin Martyr describes in some of his stuff. So the church has already taken all the good things that are out there and properly ordered them in their rightful place, within the body of Christ, to where we don't really have to go exploring too much.
Amen.
Learning and becoming better, as far as more well-rounded, is a great thing, but that doesn't mean that you have to, quit your tradition and go with those guys.
Very well said. And like, if you read documents like Nostra Aetate or Dominus Jesus from Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, I think he wrote that when he was head of the CDF. But yeah, I mean, again, right? Truth is everywhere, and the church, head and body, Jesus Christ and his members, take those good things and bring them to their full flowering and fulfillment. And anything that's of the enemy or darkness or error, it gets banished, so that you see the good in the fullness of the light for what it is, right? And that's the beautiful thing. That's what I love about Catholicism, is like a lot of these like fundamentalist Protestantism, for example, it's either this or that. It's this or everything else is wholly demonic. But
totally.
I mean, there could be demonic elements in things, of course, but that doesn't mean we reject the good, the true, and the beautiful. I mean, I think
don't throw the baby out with the
bathwater. Yeah, I think one of our saints said, I think he said something like Aristotle or Plato was the first Christian. So
something like that.
Yeah. So it just shows you, right? There's types and shadows everywhere, but they're brought to the fullness of the light and truth and deified in Jesus Christ and his Catholic Church. So we don't have to reject all that is good found elsewhere, but we can appropriate it. And I mean, not appropriate it, but it's already there in our tradition. Baptized.
They are there. We see those little flowerings in these religions because these are literally imprinted in the heart.
Right.
Man expresses these religious inclinations, these sort of longings for the Word incarnate. He expresses these through his prayers and the rituals that we've seen throughout human history. And we see that Christ is the fulfillment of those things. So when we say like, oh, there's goods in these religions and stuff like that, well, those are just because it's written in the human heart, and these people are bringing it to the table with greater or lesser degrees of accuracy.
Exactly.
But this is why I say that, Christ, it's not so much that you need really good arguments for Christ, because we have to look inside and see that the Word incarnate is like almost embedded, is sealed in our hearts. You know what I mean? So if that is true, we should see examples of, people thinking of God and man perhaps in an incorrect way. They might think of guys like Hercules, that's wrong, but they kind of understood that there's that meeting place of the human and the divine in a very real way, even talking about, the various tendencies within these religions being somewhat similar. There's these meals that take place where even in Tantric Buddhism, it's understood that the bread and the wine in the cup are flesh and blood. That this is a tantric sok feast, where it's like this divine thing. You know what I mean? Like those tendencies and those inclinations are sort of impressed on the human conscience, and they're just sort of brought to fore again with greater or lesser degrees of accuracy.
Yeah, and that's like St. Paul says, it's like the law written on the hearts of the Gentiles.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
exactly it. The imprint. We're all how would I say this? We're all words in the Word of God. We're all logoi within the logos.
Amen.
So that imprint is there in our hearts already, and that universal longing is expressed through greater or lesser degrees of accuracy in these other religions. But the truth that is found is Christ. He's there. It's not a parallel truth. It's
Amen.
It's not relativism. It's not, we're not talking about that, but these elements of truth are truth itself, who is Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, even, with it being imprinted on all of us, and this is kind of like what with Gentiles, we have situations where we might have a culture or a person who understands that there is the one God, right? And they don't worship other gods. They know the creator, if you will. Paul
Right.
encountered people like that in the Areopagus, where to the unknown God. Well, this is the God that I'm talking about, the unknown one.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of these cultures are actually doing that, where, you know, perhaps some of our friends in the Jewish and Christian communities would say no, you know, because they have a statue or something like that. But the truth is that if they are not worshiping a statue, if they understand that this is the creator and they're looking at the statue in the same way that perhaps a Jewish person would look at the temple, where it's not God, but this is the sort of enduring presence of God. It represents God to us. You know, this is what it means for us. If he's doing the same thing with like an image or something like that, is he a sinner? And I think that the Apostle Paul would say, no, the man has committed no sin. He's not actually violating a law on graven images because he's not a Jew. You know, there's
Right.
a bunch of different things going there. But that even brings me back. I was watching this Protestant guy. He was criticizing Catholicism on icons, and he had a lot going on. You know, I think we've all heard of him. You know,
Yeah.
We know the video. You've done a couple of responses yourself. But it's interesting that he would say, you know, the apostles didn't draw icons and stuff like that. Well, that's not how their culture expressed that kind of veneration. They had the temple. They had grown up venerating icons already. They were venerating the temple. They were venerating the place that the ark should rest. They were venerating the holy priesthood. They were venerating the very incense that the priest would cast into the fire. You know, that thing is, and it's not just unique to Judaism. The Jews were not the only people doing that.
Right.
Greeks were doing that. Buddhists
Right.
are doing that. You know, this is part of that indelible mark, so to speak, that the word seals on us when he calls us into existence.
Amen. My battery is going to die pretty soon.
I too.
Regrettably. So let me just see how much I have left here. Okay,
Yeah.
I've got just enough, hopefully, to cover your return. So you're entrenched. You're entrenched in Buddhism.
Yes.
You're not playing any games. You're not flirting with like Western or New Age appropriations of Buddhism. No, you're in the woods.
Yep.
Okay, so how do you go from that? How did you come back home to the Catholic Church? And what would you say to somebody who's been where you're at and needs to be Catholic? How did you come back, and why should anybody become Catholic or stay Catholic?
So what brought me back first and foremost was a recognition that I had it all wrong. That really my anger towards Christ and my anger towards the church was really unjustified. That my marriage failed because I let it fail. My marriage failed because she let it fail. We failed each other in our commitments. So there was that. I had to take a lot of time to really reflect on those things. Another thing that happened to me was that I had begun to read the scriptures again, just to see, you know, just getting into them. And I started reading the Old Testament, and I started, you know, getting to stories about David. I'd probably read the Old Testament maybe like 10 times. I mean, like back to back, just rereading it. I was kind of over the whole, I don't want to hear about Jesus right now. But I realized that even in our heritage as Abrahamic theists, we have a very strong view of meditation. And sort of Jacob, for example, went out into the field to meditate, you know, like all kinds of stuff like that. So I started to realize that really I didn't have to even reject anything. I could have used all of these different techniques that I use to make myself a better person within the churches, within the church. So, but what really brought me back was I was sort of struggling with understanding how Jesus fits into any of it.
Right.
And I simply prayed. I simply prayed that if Christ is Lord, somehow he would make that known to me. And it was the first time I had been talking to you for a while, telling you that I didn't want to pray in Jesus's name. I didn't want to address prayers to him. So the first time I did it, it was like he just kind of got involved immediately. And he started basically reproaching me for a lot of my sins. Again, it's not so much that I was reading these dogmatic treatises and stuff. I had already done that in my life.
Yeah, for sure.
What was happening to me was that, remember I said there's these occurrences and situations that we find ourselves in that there's a built-in meaning that we have to discover within those circumstances. And that's what was happening to me, whether it be in situations at work where I would kind of sit and think like, what am I supposed to do with this? And I would realize that this is me being called to repentance. It's me being called to fix what I've broken in myself. Because I could cover it up and say, I'm doing better as a Buddhist, but the truth is that you're still hurt because you're not actually facing who you are as a person. Instead, you're running away from it, trying to become someone else. Now you're this Buddhist Yeshe Rangjung, but the truth is that you're still very much Nick Chinappi, worried about what was happening at the church. You're mad at the church. Now you're questioning the church. So I had to kind of take some prayer and really let Christ work in my life to where he literally condemned me for a variety of things, at least inside myself. I started to notice what was wrong with the trajectory that I was on, that you might be able to be a little bit healthier, as far as, being able to be mindful and things like that, but you're losing out on other things. You're leaving like these gaping holes in your own heart and not giving them time to heal, And so, so it was I would say a very slow process actually coming back to the church, right? I mean, normally it was, for me, teeter-tottering with Orthodoxy and Catholicism, it was more or less kind of a quicker decision, whereas here it took me a while to warm up to Jesus. I asked him to be real in my life. And I can't really define that to people. I can't tell you that, like, I didn't know obedience to Christ out of love before I started thirsting for it. And before I started, looking for that in my life. I didn't know, that he literally is living in my life. I mean, I told you when I first prayed for his assistance, it was almost like he responded to me in a way that was like in my head, where he was like, what I want you to do. What I want you to do, And the truth is that it really wasn't, you need to turn the car around right now and go to confession. No, it was, I want you to right your situation. I want you to make your situation right. I want you to fix it. I want you to come to me in repentance, but I want you to come to me and let me help you. When we separate ourselves, we might think that, I don't want to ask God for another chance. But the truth is that God is actually the one to say, hey, come back to me. Give me another chance. Let's talk this out. Let's make this work. So that's kind of what happened to me. There's a lot. I think we're going to have to do another episode where I kind of dive into Buddhist teaching. This is a good little, preliminary thing, but there's a lot of stuff that I came to realize even about Buddhist teaching, which low key kind of exalt Christ. There's a lot of teachings in Buddhism that I always understood were contrary to Christianity, but rather are Christian teachings. So, my advice to people who might find Buddhism interesting or an interesting outlet is that there's nothing in any world religion that will necessarily satisfy you until you seek out the reason for your seeking. And many of us begin looking at other options when we're disenchanted with what we've already committed to. For example, Catholicism, ugly liturgies, the priest gave a homily that I didn't like, I'm not receiving very good advice in confession. I'm troubled by the Pope, or I'm troubled about people who are antagonistic to the Pope. You have to make peace inside yourself before you go. You have to kind of make sense of why you're even curious, and my advice would be to not make very quick decisions only in your head. I have a habit of doing that. My advice would be to involve people, communicate to people. The one thing that I did differently this time when I came to the church is that I did communicate to my Buddhist teacher. I communicated to my Catholic friends. I reached out to even a couple of Orthodox friends. I also started having a really good relationship with our pastor here. I wanted to involve people this time because I am always that guy who relies only on his own wisdom and almost always makes bad decisions. So I really, really wanted to kind of not keep a secret and not kind of give the evil one a chance to gain the upper hand. You know what I mean? I wanted to put everything out there, and I brought Christ into the picture through prayer, and I think that he navigated me flawlessly.
Oh, thanks be to God, brother. What a testimony. I mean, you've never done this before. You've never been on a podcast before. And let me say, as somebody who's done 99 episodes, I'm about to have a diamond jubilee. My next episode will be 100. You seem like you've done this 1,000 times. Like you were born for this. And I just know that you have such a story to tell. You're such a witness that the Holy Spirit has just empowered you and graced you to do this today and future episodes, because there's things that we want to cover some more, like you said, Buddhist teachings that actually line up with Christianity, and when brought into the church, how they're already there and they're purified, and maybe common ground or parts of dialogue that we can have to be successful with one another. And I also, you have a wonderful outlook on the state of the church for people who are either in the church who are troubled by the state of things, or people on the outside looking in saying, I don't want any part of this because of the state of the church. Your outlook, your take, your mindset is truly one of the saints and the great reformers of the church. And that's obviously, yes, that's you, but you've been given a gift by God. And I think that it is incumbent upon you, because you could help so many souls who are struggling both inside and outside the church, to share that with people. So we're going to do a future episode for sure. This was obviously great sharing your testimony and some preliminary thoughts on other things. And I can't wait to have you back on, bro. I really appreciate your time. I thought I had my stream last night with Rachel Fulton Brown on why Mary proves Catholicism is the ancient path. That was 2 hours and 6 minutes. We're now going on 2 hours and 7 minutes. So I think this has been my longest show.
Yeah.
And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you, brother. So thank you. And I just want to let everybody know that you've been tuned into Holy Smoke, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. This was episode 99. A prodigal son returns home from Eastern Orthodoxy and Buddhism, with my dear friend Nick Chinappi. Nick, I can't wait to have you on again, brother. And we'll see you all again soon. I got some shows coming up, God willing, if the schedule works out, with William Albrecht on the papacy and the canon. So I will end it there. And thank you again, Brother Nick. And we'll talk again soon. And for everybody out there, have a great Sunday. Happy Thanksgiving for my Canadian friends. And God bless. I'm going to end the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.